The Ansonia, 60 minutes inside New York's most impossible building. On a winter evening, Broadway looks like it is made of reflections. Headlights stretch into soft ribbons on wet pavement. A subway growls below the street. Steam rises at the curb and turns the air into a moving curtain. Then you look up. At the corner of Broadway and 73rd Street, a building stands like a ship built from stone. Towers, balconies, a roofline that feels imported from another continent. Its name is the Ansonia. The Ansonia comes with stories that sound like challenges. In the early years, people claimed the lobby held a fountain with live seals swimming inside. Not carved animals, not painted illusions. Living bodies, glossy backs cutting the water while residents crossed the marble floor, as if this were ordinary. Then there was the roof, not merely a garden, a farm. Chickens and ducks, goats, pigs, eggs delivered downward through service corridors, as if the building could feed its own residents. Even if you have heard those tales, the real question is not whether the stories were exaggerated. The real question is why a building would invite that kind of story in the first place. Because the Ansonia was built to do something no normal residents should attempt. It tried to become a complete world, a building that could entertain you, feed you, protect you, and hide you. A building that could make the city outside feel optional. Here is the hook that will guide everything you hear tonight. When a building promises to be a whole world, it attracts everything a world contains. Music and ambition, luxury and envy, power and secrecy, and sometimes violence. Because the Ansonia never gives you a clean ending, it gives you another hallway. Tonight, listen for the objects that repeat in different forms. A key that grants access. A letter that threatens removal. A door that closes softly while something important happens inside. The Ansonia is not famous only because it is beautiful. It is famous because it concentrates choices. Where people live, who they meet, what they dare to do when they believe no one is listening. And as we move through decades, you will notice a strange pattern. The building keeps offering the same promise, even as the city changes. Come inside and the outside world will not touch you. That promise can feel like safety. It can also feel like permission. By the time we reach the end, you may see the Ansonia differently. Not as a quirky landmark with old rumors, but as a mirror. A mirror held up to New York's hunger for privacy, status, reinvention, and survival. At the end of the 19th century, Manhattan was stretching north. Transit lines made neighborhoods possible. Real estate speculators measured blocks like chessboards. Upper Broadway was no longer a distant edge. It was the next battlefield for wealth. William Earl Dodge Stokes entered that battlefield already armed. He was born into money with powerful industrial connections and a family name that already carried weight. He did not need to build to survive. He wanted to build to announce himself. Some developers respond to demand. Stokes responded to desire, not the city's desire, his own. He wanted a monument. He chose a site on Broadway between 73rd and 74th Street. A place where every passerby would be forced to see the result. Then he insisted on scale. A tall building with hundreds of suites. A structure large enough that newspapers could describe it as one of the biggest apartment hotels of its era. But size was not the only statement. Stokes wanted style that felt aristocratic, even if the money behind it was industrial. So he aimed for a French-flavored fantasy, a Beaux-Arts palace translated into New York stone, a roofline with towers, balconies like jewelry, ornament that made the building look expensive even from across the avenue. To draw it, he hired Paul-Émile Dubois, a French architect. Yet descriptions of the project make clear that the architect worked under Stokes' very specific direction. Dubois provided the language. Stokes dictated the message. That message had one theme: control. Stokes feared the things a city can do to a building: fire, decay, chaos. He wanted a fortress that could resist those forces. So he pushed for heavy construction and thick interior partitions. He treated fire resistance as a selling point. He also tried to control production and installation through business connections. In modern terms, he wanted vertical integration. In human terms, he wanted to feel that the building belonged to his will. Construction began in 1899. It was expensive, complicated, and slow. By the time the Ansonia opened in 1904, it had become more than a project. It was a public declaration. Now, if you want to understand why the Ansonia later attracted both art and scandal, you have to grasp what Stokes was actually selling. He was selling a private kingdom, and a private kingdom needs its own systems. It is easy to picture the Ansonia as always old, always weathered, always carrying the dust of other people's decades. But every historic building begins as something fresh. In 1904, the Ansonia would have smelled new. Stone still holding a faint mineral coolness. Metal fixtures bright, light arranged to flatter faces, like a theater before the curtain rises. A resident arrives with luggage and the quiet confidence of someone who can afford to move slowly. A porter takes the bags without making a show of effort. A clerk hands over a key and keeps the conversation polite and short. The building is teaching everyone a rule. Comfort should look effortless. The lobby is more than a waiting area. It is a filter. It decides who belongs. It decides who is a guest and who is a problem. In a building of this scale, the staff are not only workers, they are guardians of atmosphere. Upstairs, hallways feel strangely calm for a city this loud. Thick doors and heavy partitions change the soundscape. The building softens the world. Inside a suite, a parlor sits ready for social life. A resident can host friends without letting them see private rooms. That is not a small luxury. In New York, it is status made practical. And behind it all, there is labor. Cleaners moving through service passages. Kitchen workers preparing meals that will appear as if by magic. Maintenance crews learning the building like a body, locating every valve and wire. This is the truth under the mythology. A palace is never only stone. It is schedules. It is routines. It is people trained to be unseen. That invisibility is part of why the Ansonia could later hold so many secrets. From the first week, the building was designed to hide the work that made life easy. Now imagine the first rumors spreading outside. 2 pools, people whisper. A roof garden, others say. A building so large it feels like a private city. Then someone adds a final detail, almost as a joke. There are animals in the lobby fountain. Whether that exact image was true or embellished, it lands for one reason. The Ansonia already feels like a place where the unbelievable might be normal. And when a place makes the unbelievable feel normal, it attracts people who want to live beyond ordinary rules. Which brings us straight into the next chapter. When the Ansonia opened, it offered a lifestyle that sounded like magic for the time. Not just rooms, but a network. Services built into the building, shops in the basement, staff routines that handled daily needs, amenities that turned ordinary life into a curated experience. Think about what that means in practice. You wake up in a suite that feels more like a small apartment than a hotel room. A parlor, a bedroom, sometimes multiple bedrooms. A place where you can host guests without letting them see your private rooms. You can arrange laundry without hauling baskets down the street. You can buy necessities without stepping outside into weather or crowds. You can receive deliveries through service corridors that keep the public spaces elegant. The building becomes a filter. It keeps the street out. This is the core of the Ansonia appeal. Insulation. And insulation is the rarest luxury in New York. The Ansonia also offered amenities that felt almost impossible. 2 swimming pools, a roof garden, spaces for leisure that made residents feel like members of a private club. But there is a feature that mattered more than pools to certain residents. Sound. The Ansonia gained an international reputation as a residence for musicians because its heavy construction reduced the way sound traveled between apartments. In New York, that changes everything. Practice becomes possible without war. Lessons can happen at home. A singer's daily labor does not become a public argument. A building that supports practice becomes an incubator. An incubator collects talent. Talent attracts attention. Attention attracts more talent. Over time, the Ansonia became associated with famous performers and composers. Even if you do not memorize the list of names, you can understand the effect. This was a building where art lived in the hallway. Now notice the unintended consequence. The same thick walls that protect music also protect secrecy. Privacy does not ask what it is protecting. It simply protects. So the Ansonia was built as a fortress of comfort, but it also became a fortress where whispers could survive. Keep that in your mind, because later those whispers will change history. For now, we need to look at the building as a machine. What systems made the Ansonia feel like its own world? How did it move information, people, and goods inside its stone body? Because that is where the story becomes strange, even before we reach seals and rooftop farms. When people say the Ansonia was a musician's building, it can sound like trivia, a fun fact for tours. But for the people who lived there, It was not trivia. It was survival. A professional voice is a fragile tool. It requires daily care and daily work. Breath exercises, vowels shaped again and again, repetition that can feel ridiculous until it becomes mastery. In most apartment buildings, that kind of work becomes conflict with neighbors. A knock on the wall, a note under the door, a complaint to management, a threat. In the Ansonia, the walls change the rules. Picture a morning lesson. A student arrives early, hands sweating around sheet music. Inside the suite, a teacher listens like a surgeon. A pianist plays softly. The student sings, fails, corrects, sings again. The building holds the sound, so the failure stays private. That privacy is not comfort, it is permission. Permission to be imperfect, long enough to become great. Now picture a different door on the same floor. A famous singer lives there, not performing, not smiling for crowds, just warming up, ordinary and tired. In the hallway, someone hears a fragment of a world-class voice and freezes. For a young musician, that single fragment is a jolt of possibility. If greatness lives next door, maybe it is reachable. This is how the Ansonia becomes an incubator. It concentrates practice, teaching, and ambition. And ambition always draws more ambition. But an incubator is also a pressure vessel. In a building full of artists, every success can feel like a mirror. A neighbor gets the role you wanted. A rival is invited to a party you were not. A teacher praises someone else. So the Ansonia offered privacy, but it also offered constant comparison. The building could feel like a sanctuary and like a silent competition arena at the same time. And now we return to the bigger point. Walls that protect a singer's mistakes can also protect a gambler's meeting. Walls that hide rehearsal can also hide arguments and schemes. The building does not judge. It contains. Hold that thought as we move forward, because the same architecture that nurtured art will soon become useful for much darker purposes. A grand facade is easy to admire. The harder part is the machinery that makes luxury feel effortless. In the early 20th century, modern living was not guaranteed. Heat could fail. Plumbing could be unpredictable. Communication inside a building could be slow. Elevators were still part novelty, part necessity, and part fear. Stokes wanted the Ansonia to feel advanced. He wanted residents to feel that the building itself was working for them. So, the Ansonia was filled with systems. Elevators became arteries, carrying residents and staff vertically. Service elevators separated the visible world from the labor that supported it. Corridors were planned not only for movement, but for discretion. The building aimed to hide the work that produced comfort. Communication mattered too. In large hotels of the era, internal message systems could involve bells, runners, and sometimes pneumatic tube-style devices to move notes and small items. The idea was to shrink time inside a vast structure. The Ansonia also depended on staff. Bellhops, porters, cleaners, kitchen workers, maintenance crews. A building like this is never only architecture. It is a workforce. It is schedules and routines. It is people who know which doors to knock on and which doors to avoid. Here is a detail that helps you feel the scale. In a place with hundreds of suites, the lobby is not just a lobby. It is a crossroads. It is a social filter. It is where residents are seen and strangers are evaluated. Which brings us to the Ansonia's most theatrical rumor. The seals. Whether the fountain held live seals exactly as people later told it, the story fits because the building was designed to make spectacle believable. Stokes understood that luxury is partly performance. If residents felt they were living in a story, they would pay for the role. Now, if the lobby can hold spectacle, what can the roof hold? That question is how we reach the farm. Because the rooftop farm was not only weird, it was the clearest expression of Stokes' dream. A building that could feed itself. Before we climb to the roof, step back onto Broadway and look again at the outside. Most people see a big old building and stop there. But the Ansonia facade is not random decoration. It is a message written in stone. The towers and dramatic rooflines signal ambition. They say this is not a normal apartment house. This is a palace. The repeating windows and long balconies signal scale. They say many lives happen here at once. This is not a townhouse for one family. This is a vertical neighborhood. And the ornament, the curves, the mansard silhouette, all of it signals borrowed aristocracy. Stokes' money came from the modern industrial world, but he wanted the aura of older European wealth. So the Ansonia wears European clothing. That clothing has a practical function too. Ornament breaks up mass. It creates shadow. It makes the building feel alive even when it is still. In a city where the street is a theater, shadow is part of the show. Now notice something most pedestrians miss. A building this massive cannot survive as a solid brick. It needs light and air. So the Ansonia was designed with interior courts and light wells, cutouts that let daylight reach deeper apartments and allow air to move. In the era before modern air conditioning, those choices were not luxuries, they were necessities. This is why the Ansonia is more than ego. It is ego fused with engineering. The building wanted to be theatrical, but it also wanted to be livable. That combination helps explain its long life. Some monuments collapse because they are only show. The Ansonia endured partly because its heaviness and internal planning made it durable. But durability does not mean the building can ignore consequences. The same internal courts that bring light also bring sound patterns and privacy patterns. You can be close to neighbors and still never meet them. You can share a vertical city and remain a stranger. In a building like this, you are always near other lives, and yet you can still vanish. That is not only architecture, that is psychology. And once you understand the facade as a message, the rooftop farm makes even more sense. It is the next line in the same argument. A palace should not depend on the street. A palace should provide its own comfort. A palace should feel like a world. So when we climb upward, we are not only visiting a roof, we are watching the building try to complete its dream. In the next chapter, that dream meets the city's rules. Rooftops in New York usually hold water tanks and quiet patience. They are not supposed to smell like barns. Yet the Ansonia roof was reported to host a farm. Accounts describe poultry, goats, pigs, and stories that grow wilder in the retelling. Eggs delivered to residents as if the building were a self-producing organism. Why would anyone attempt this? Partly for practicality, partly for theater, and partly for a deeper motive. Stokes wanted a closed loop. He wanted the Ansonia to provide not only shelter, but sustenance. He wanted to prove that architecture and management could simulate a self-sufficient world. If you listen closely, you can hear the same impulse modern developers sell with cleaner words. Self-contained living, amenities without leaving, community inside the building. The Ansonia attempted that a century early, with animals as proof. But the city had a problem with proof that smelled. Sanitation rules existed for reasons that do not care about a man's ego. Neighbors complained. Officials paid attention. A raid happened. The farm was shut down. Animals were removed, with stories claiming they were sent to Central Park. Imagine the scene. Health inspectors stepping among pens above Broadway. The skyline around them. The city below. A private fantasy confronted by public law. This is the first time the Ansonia collides with the idea of limits. Limits imposed by government. Limits imposed by common sense. Limits imposed by the fact that other people live nearby. Stokes reacted the way he often did, by trying to maneuver. Some accounts say he claimed the animals belonged to his son, as if responsibility could be transferred along with ownership. The maneuver failed. The roof returned to being a roof. But the lesson remains. Stokes did not accept limits easily. And the next limit he challenged was not about sanitation. It was about his own life. Because soon, Stokes would be on the front page in a scandal that permanently stained the Ansonius mythology. William Earl Dodge Stokes was known for litigation. Courts were familiar territory. Conflicts followed him. In 1911, he secretly married Helen Blanche Elwood, a much younger woman, despite a judge's restriction connected to his divorce. He did it quietly because he knew he was crossing a line. Then came the event that made the story impossible to ignore. In June 1911, Stokes was shot by a young actress named Lillian Graham. Two narratives collided. Graham said Stokes attacked her, and she fired to defend herself. Stokes claimed Graham was trying to blackmail him with compromising letters and shot him when her scheme failed. Either way, the ingredients were guaranteed to ignite a city. Sex, money, power, a gun, private letters that could destroy reputations, a trial that turned intimate life into public spectacle. Graham was found not guilty. The verdict did not create clarity. It created fog, and fog is the perfect environment for myth. From this point on, the Ansonia is no longer only an eccentric luxury building. It is tied to scandal at the level of its creator. Stokes believed he might die from his wounds. Under pressure, he leased the Ansonia to Frank Harriman on a long-term basis. That business decision changed the building's social chemistry. Harriman planned to convert the building into a more transient hotel by dividing large suites into smaller rooms. This did not merely alter floor plans. It altered the building's moral atmosphere. Long-term residents create memory. They recognize each other. They build informal rules. They notice when something is wrong. Transient guests create anonymity. Anonymity lowers risk for people who want to reinvent themselves. It also lowers risk for people who want to hide. The Ansonia was built with thick walls that protected privacy. Now it would host more people who needed privacy for reasons unrelated to art. The building was becoming a mask, and masks attract certain kinds of faces. The shooting of William Earl Dodge Stokes did not only injure a man, it transformed the Ansonia into a headline. Newspapers fed on the story because it had everything: a powerful developer, a young actress, letters that hinted at private compromises, a gunshot that turned whispers into public spectacle. In the courtroom, every detail became performance. People watched the testimony the way they watched theater. Who looked confident, who looked frightened, who sounded believable. Stokes claimed he was being blackmailed. Lillian Graham claimed she was defending herself from assault. The truth was buried under power, fear, and reputation. And the city did what the city always does with ambiguity. It filled the gaps with imagination. Even after Graham was found not guilty, the story did not end. It hardened into rumor and moral debate. Some people framed Stokes as predator. Some framed him as victim. Some framed Graham as desperate. Some framed her as manipulator. A scandal does not need a single agreed truth to be effective. It only needs enough uncertainty to keep people talking. Now, place that scandal back inside the Ansonia. Imagine living in the building and hearing the name of your address spoken on the street with a certain tone. Not admiration, not envy, a fascination that feels like a warning. The Ansonia had been marketed as a private kingdom. Now the kingdom was exposed. People who had never cared about architecture suddenly cared about the building because it was attached to a human drama. This is why the management shift matters. When Stokes leased the building to Frank Harriman, it was not only a financial decision, it was a psychological pivot. It opened the door to a more transient identity, with more rooms, more guests, more movement. And movement changes everything. A stable community tends to police itself. A constant flow of strangers does not. A constant flow of strangers creates opportunity for reinvention, and also opportunity for harm. After the trial, the Ansonia was no longer only a palace. It was a palace with a shadow, a place where you could live richly and still feel that the world outside was watching. That feeling is one reason the building became such a perfect container for private deals. And the next private deal we meet will not be about romance or letters. It will be about money, sport, and betrayal. Early 20th century New York was not just glamour. It was also conflict, political movements, labor fights, organized crime, international war. A city that made money fast also produced danger fast. Large hotels became nodes in that world. They were places where strangers could meet under cover of luxury. They were places where staff saw everything but were trained to say nothing. They were places where you could be anonymous even while surrounded by people. The Ansonia fit that pattern, especially after it leaned more heavily into hotel-style operations. During World War I, reports describe authorities thwarting a plot by German operatives to bomb the Ansonia ballroom. Whatever the exact details, the point stands. The building was prominent enough to be included in wartime threat stories. A ballroom designed for music became a potential target. That tells you how visible the Ansonia was, and how symbolic. Now, move from wartime threats to the criminal economy of the city. One figure tied to the Ansonia legend was Albert James Adams, called the Policy King, who built wealth through illegal lottery operations. Accounts place him at the Ansonia. Accounts also describe his death there, a bullet, and a coroner's determination of suicide. New York did what New York does. It doubted. It whispered about murder. It invented motives. It is important to be careful here. Rumor is not evidence, but rumor is part of the Ansonia's reality, because rumor shapes how people perceive a place. From this point, the building carried an aura, a sense that behind its ornate doors, anything could happen. That aura becomes a magnet, and it sets up a chapter that connects the Ansonia to one of the most infamous scandals in American sports. In 1919, baseball was America's shared dream. The World Series was not just a game, it was a national ritual. The Chicago White Sox arrived in New York. Accounts place a meeting at the Ansonia in a room associated with first baseman Chick Gandil. Players gathered. A plan was discussed. Throw the series. Accept money. Lose on purpose. The scandal that followed became known as the Black Sox. Players were banned. Public faith was damaged. The idea that the game could be fixed became part of American memory. Even if you debate which sentence was said by which person in which room, the Ansonia's role in the legend is meaningful. It was the kind of place where such a meeting could occur without being interrupted. A room you could rent. A building large enough to hide you in plain sight. Walls thick enough to muffle sound. Picture the moment. Curtains drawn. Cigarette smoke. Men weighing money against reputation. A city outside cheering for a sport that is about to be betrayed. This is where the Ansonia shows its second face. Not the palace of music, but the palace of secrecy. Now, I want to slow down and make something clear. A building does not commit crimes. People do. But architecture shapes what feels possible. If secrecy is easy, conspiracy becomes easier. If anonymity is cheap, betrayal becomes cheaper. The Ansonia made privacy feel normal. That is why the meeting belongs to its story. Now we pivot back to the building's gentler identity, because without it, the Ansonia might have been abandoned later. Music. It is easy to tell the Black Sox scandal like a simple morality tale. Good men turned bad. A sport was corrupted. Justice followed. Real life is not that clean. Players in 1919 were not earning modern fortunes. Some felt underpaid. Some felt trapped by owners who held power. Some carried debts, family pressure, resentment, and exhaustion. In that environment, money offered quietly can feel like air. Now imagine those pressures inside a hotel room. One man frames the fix as business. The world is unfair, he says. We are only taking what we deserve. Another man sits on the edge of a bed, staring at the floor, trying to find a way to accept money without accepting shame. A third man stays quiet, and his silence becomes a decision disguised as hesitation. That is how a conspiracy forms. Not with dramatic speeches, but with rationalization. The Ansonia mattered because it made the meeting easy. A room could be rented. Strangers could enter without creating a scene. The building was large enough to swallow them. The walls were thick enough to keep the words inside. And once the words stay inside, the outside world cannot intervene. The tragedy of a fix is not only what happens on the field, it is what happens in the mind. A person convinces themselves that the betrayal is temporary, that they will return to honor afterward, that no one will ever know. But history has a way of finding the places where decisions were made. That is why the Ansonia stays attached to this story, because the building did what it was built to do. It provided privacy. In the next chapter, we return to the Ansonia's gentler reputation, music, and we ask a harder question. If a building makes secrecy easy, can it ever control what secrecy is used for? The Ansonia became known internationally as a residence for musicians. Its heavy construction reduced the spread of sound between apartments in a way residents valued. In a city where thin walls can ruin careers, this mattered. Over time, the building became associated with famous performers and composers. Names linked to the Ansonia include opera star Enrico Caruso and a remarkable roster of musicians. But rather than list names, let us paint the world. Imagine an afternoon in the Ansonia around 1910. A student climbs the stairs, clutching sheet music, nervous and hopeful. They knock on a door. Inside, a teacher waits with the calm of someone who has heard every mistake before. A pianist sits ready. The student sings a phrase and fails. No one laughs. The teacher adjusts the vowels. The student tries again. The building absorbs the flawed attempts and keeps them private. This is the hidden labor behind fame. Hours of practice that the public never sees. In a normal apartment building, that labor becomes conflict with neighbors. In the Ansonia, it can happen quietly. So the building becomes an incubator, not only for music, but for ambition. Ambition creates rivalry. Rivalry creates tension. And tension creates stories that never reach the newspaper, but shape lives. An elevator ride can become a moment of awe if a famous singer steps in. A hallway can feel like a backstage corridor. A lobby can feel like a theater in daylight. This is why people later called the Ansonia a palace for the muses. It sheltered talent. But remember what we said earlier. The walls hide everything equally. They hide beauty and they hide harm. And the city around the building was changing quickly. The Ansonia entered the 920 seconds, with a reputation that felt permanent. The city was roaring. Prohibition pushed nightlife into private spaces. Hotels and large apartment houses became stages for both respectability and indulgence. The Ansonia fit the decade like a tailored suit. Its lobby could host society without embarrassment. Its private rooms could host secrets without witnesses. Its ballrooms and gathering spaces gave people a sense of belonging to something bigger than an address. But buildings do not live on reputation alone. They live on maintenance, and maintenance costs money. Then the Great Depression arrived and squeezed every promise. Luxury became harder to sustain. Repairs were delayed. Ornament suffered. When care becomes expensive, a palace begins to fray in slow motion. This is how decline actually looks. Not a dramatic collapse. A stair rail that loosens. A leak that stains a ceiling. A balcony that becomes unsafe and is removed instead of restored. A lobby that loses some of its shine, then loses more. At the same time, the city's centers of glamour shifted. New addresses competed. Upper Broadway was no longer the edge of the future. It was part of the established city, and established places can become taken for granted. Yet the Ansonia retained something powerful. Its silhouette. People still recognized it. People still told stories. And in New York, story is a kind of currency. That currency kept the building psychologically alive, even as its physical condition worsened. A place can be famous and worn at the same time. That mixed identity attracts two kinds of people: those who want the prestige of the myth, and those who want the opportunities created by neglect. If a building feels half protected and half forgotten, it becomes a perfect stage for reinvention. Not always beautiful reinvention. Sometimes reinvention that lives in shadows. This is why the Ansonia moves through the middle decades as both landmark and trouble spot. It is a palace that the city remembers, but it is also a palace that can be exploited. By the time New York enters its later crisis years, the Ansonia is no longer only a destination. It is a problem to solve and a story to defend. And that is when the battle over what the building should be becomes unavoidable. The 1,920 seconds brought nightlife, prohibition, and a culture that loved spectacle. Hotels became stages. Rumors traveled faster than facts. The Ansonia, with its grand spaces and private rooms, fit the era perfectly. It could host respectable gatherings and private indulgence under the same roof. Then the Great Depression arrived. Money tightened, luxury became harder to sustain, maintenance became more difficult. A building filled with ornament is a building that requires constant care. When care becomes expensive, the palace begins to fray. The Ansonia did not collapse overnight. Buildings rarely do. They fade in slow motion. Repairs are delayed. Water finds cracks. Ornament loosens. Public spaces lose shine. Rooms are subdivided again and again to make rents possible. At the same time, the Upper West Side itself evolved. What was once a symbol of new luxury became older housing. The city's center of glamour shifted. New addresses competed. Yet the Ansonia retained something valuable. Its myth. People still recognized the silhouette. People still remembered the stories. And in a city that sells stories, myth can be a form of currency. But myth cannot replace plumbing. Myth cannot pay to repair balconies. Myth cannot guarantee safety. So by the mid-20th century, the Ansonia entered a common New York phase. It was famous and worn at the same time. That condition creates vulnerability, and vulnerability invites a new kind of reinvention. By the late 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds, New York was in turmoil. The city faced financial strain. Crime and neglect rose in many areas. Landlords fought tenants. Buildings across the city decayed. The Ansonia carried its own scars. Alterations, aging systems, damage. A sense that the palace was tired, yet in the basement, something unexpected happened. The Continental Baths opened. A gay bathhouse in the Ansonia basement became more than a place for privacy. It became a refuge, a social environment, and famously, an entertainment venue. The significance is hard to overstate. At a time when many institutions excluded or punished gay life, the Continental Baths provided a space where community could exist and flourish. And in that space, performances took place. One performer associated with those shows was Bette Midler, who performed there in the early 1,970 seconds. Barry Manilow accompanied her on piano. Think about the layers. A building famous for soundproof walls and musicians becomes the container for a basement stage that trains a new kind of star. Not an opera house, not a formal theater, a bathhouse underground. This is New York's talent for reinvention. It turns leftover spaces into launch pads. And the basement story did not stop with one era. The underground space became linked to other nightlife chapters later, including a swingers club that became infamous. So by the 1970 seconds, the Ansonia held multiple worlds at once. Long-term tenants upstairs, underground nightlife below, owners trying to manage costs, tenants fighting for stability. A building that felt like both a home and a battlefield. That tension leads to the most important bureaucratic moment in the Ansonia story. Landmark designation. To understand the Continental Baths era, do not picture a glamorous theater. Picture a space that feels close, warm, and alive. People arrive with cautious excitement, some with relief, some with nerves, some with a hunger to belong somewhere without explanation. The basement air carries moisture and echo. Tile and steam turn voices into a soft blur. Then music begins, and the blur sharpens into attention. A performer steps into that attention and learns a lesson that no rehearsal room can teach. A crowd this close can see everything. If you are pretending, they know. If you are afraid, they know. If you are real, they reward you immediately. This is why the Continental Baths performances mattered. They were not only entertainment, they were training in presence. Bette Midler, in those early 1970 seconds shows, became part of the building's evolving myth, with Barry Manilow at the piano. Not because the location was elegant, but because it was electric. A small room can create a kind of intensity that large venues cannot manufacture. Meanwhile, upstairs, the Ansonia continued its ordinary struggles. Tenants worried about repairs. Owners worried about costs. Hallways carried the quiet tension of a building trying to survive. That split is the Ansonia in one image. Above ground, a tired palace. Below ground, a living engine of culture. And it reveals a New York truth. When the surface of the city is under pressure, the underground often becomes the laboratory. Later, the basement world changed again, and different nightlife chapters attach themselves to the address. But the deeper pattern stays consistent. The Ansonia keeps providing space for private life, and private life keeps producing stories. In 1972, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission designated the Ansonia as a landmark. The owner opposed the designation. Public response was enormous. Letters and petitions poured in, with tens of thousands of signatures supporting preservation. This matters because landmark status changes a building's future. It limits what owners can alter. It requires a certain level of care. It turns private property into public responsibility. The commission noted damage and alterations, missing or damaged balconies, changes at the street level, commercial intrusions, building violations, many described as minor, but numerous enough to signal neglect. In everyday language, the building was wounded, but the city believed it could be saved. Saving, however, is not a single act. It is a long negotiation between money, law, and human stubbornness. In the years that followed, the Ansonia became a site of ongoing conflict. Restoration costs were high. Tenants wanted stability. Owners wanted profit. Lawyers became regular characters. This is not as glamorous as a rooftop farm, but it is more important. It is the reason the Ansonia did not vanish. Because without a preservation fight, a building like this can be reduced to rubble and replaced by something efficient and forgettable. The Ansonia survived long enough to reach a new economic model. In the early 1990 seconds, it became condominiums. From the outside, landmark designation sounds like a stamp in a file. Inside the city, it can feel like a street fight conducted with polite language. When the Ansonia was designated a landmark in 1972, the building became a public argument. Some people saw a masterpiece that should never be lost. Others saw an expensive problem being forced into private hands. Supporters organized because they understood something simple. Once a building like this is gone, you cannot rebuild the same history. You can imitate ornament, but you cannot imitate decades of lived life. You cannot recreate the way music once filled these hallways, or the way the building absorbed the city's changing moods. So petitions circulated, letters poured into city offices. Residents spoke up, not only because they loved the facade, but because they loved what the building represented. Stubborn survival. Old New York, refusing to be erased. Opponents had their own logic. A landmark can freeze a building in time while bills keep moving. Owners can feel trapped between requirements and finances. Repairs that would be optional in a normal building become obligations in a landmark. This is where the Ansonia story becomes less romantic and more honest. Saving history costs money, and in New York, money always has a voice. During these years, the building felt like it was living two lives. On paper, it was a treasured landmark. In reality, it was aging and vulnerable. You can picture the contradiction in one image. Scaffolding outside to catch falling pieces. Inside, tenants navigating hallway repairs, temporary patches, and a constant sense that the building might be sliding toward danger. Landmark rules did not instantly restore the Ansonia. They created a framework for the fight. And the fight was exhausting. Owners argued about what was required. Tenants argued about what was safe. Inspectors wrote reports. Lawyers wrote responses. Everyone waited for the next decision. This is the slow violence of urban conflict. Not blood, not gunshots, but paperwork that shapes whether your home survives. Yet the pressure produced something important. It kept the Ansonia visible as a public responsibility. It prevented the easiest outcome: demolition and replacement. In a city full of forgettable new buildings, that matters. Because the Ansonia is not only pretty, it is a record of an era when developers still believed architecture could sell a fantasy of total living. Over time, the preservation framework helped push the building toward a different economic model, one that could fund larger repairs. That is the bridge into the next chapter. The legend becomes an asset, and the Ansonia begins to survive through ownership rather than through myth alone. Condominium conversion changes a building in ways that are both visible and invisible. Visible changes include renovations, repairs, restored ornament, updated systems. Invisible changes include social chemistry. Who owns? Who rents? Who can stay? Who is pushed out? Who gains power in building decisions? In the early 1992s, the Ansonia was converted into condominiums. Some long-term residents remained under rent regulation, while other units entered a luxury market. The building moved again toward prestige. But this was a modern prestige shaped by real estate economics, not by early 20th century spectacle. Over time, restoration revived parts of the facade. The palace regained some shine. The silhouette remained iconic. Then, popular culture found the building again. The Ansonia's look helped inspire fictional apartment buildings used in murder mystery stories. The appeal makes sense. A building with ornate doors, long corridors, and hidden layers feels like it was designed for secrets. But the Ansonia does not need fiction to be interesting. It already contains more genres than most novels. And that brings us to the final act. We have traveled through decades. Now, I want to make the Ansonia feel immediate. In the next chapter, we reconstruct a single day inside the building across time. Not a single invented date, but a composite built from the kinds of life the Ansonia has contained. Because a building like this is best understood not as a timeline, but as a rhythm. When people talk about saving a historic building, they picture scaffolding and restored stone. They picture heroic construction. They picture a ribbon cutting. Inside the building, survival often feels less cinematic. It feels like paperwork. A letter with a date at the top. A notice slipped under a door. A paragraph that turns a hallway into a battlefield. This is a New York truth. The city is built not only from stone and steel. It is built from rules, leases, and disputes that arrive in envelopes. Imagine being a long-term tenant in the Ansonia after decades of change. You have watched the building shift from prestige to wear. You have watched repairs delayed. You have watched businesses come and go. Your home has survived, but it has never been fully stable. Then a letter arrives. Maybe it announces a renovation plan. Maybe it hints at a change in ownership. Maybe it pressures you to move. Maybe it promises repairs and fails to deliver. Whatever it says, the emotion is the same. A tightness in the chest, the sense that your life is being negotiated by people who do not know your name. Now imagine the owner side. Landmark status can limit fast, cheap solutions. Restoration costs can be enormous. Income may not match the work required. The building can feel like a burden and an opportunity at the same time. So the letters multiply. Tenants organize. Owners hire attorneys. City agencies cite violations. Preservationists demand standards. The building becomes a legal organism, alive with documents. This is why condominium conversion becomes such a dramatic pivot. It changes the meaning of power inside the building. Ownership becomes distributed. Decisions become political. Money enters the story as both rescue and threat. Some people see conversion as salvation because repairs finally happen. Others see it as erasure because communities built over decades can be pushed aside by prices. Both perceptions can be true. The Ansonia survives, but its internal world changes. And that raises the question we end with. If a building is saved physically, what happens to the memories that made it worth saving? Morning, 1904. The lobby is new enough to smell like stone and polish. Staff stand ready. A resident descends in an elevator, holding a newspaper and moving with the calm of someone who expects service to appear. In service corridors, deliveries arrive. Food, laundry, packages. If the rooftop farm is operating, eggs appear in baskets, moving downward in quiet routine. A guest enters the lobby. They glance at the fountain. If the seal story is true for this moment, a dark shape cuts through the water and the guest hesitates, then decides not to ask questions. Because in a building like this, questions feel impolite. Late morning, 1910. A pianist repeats a phrase. A singer warms up. The walls swallow sound. This is not romance. It is work. Art built from repetition. A student leaves a lesson with trembling hands. The city outside feels loud and harsh. Inside the Ansonia, the student felt protected. They return tomorrow. Afternoon, 1919. A group enters a room with the posture of secrecy. They do not smile much. They speak in short bursts. They discuss money and risk. They do not know yet what history will call them. They only know what they want. Evening, 1971. The basement is alive with a different kind of city. A line forms quietly. Inside, laughter breaks through tension. A performer takes the stage. The audience is close enough that every expression matters. This is a laboratory for charisma, a place where a voice learns how to command attention. Above, a resident tries to sleep. A maintenance worker checks pipes. A landlord argues with an attorney. A tenant reads a letter and feels fear tighten their throat. Morning, 1993. A renovated corridor smells of fresh paint. A new owner walks the hall with the cautious satisfaction of investment. A long-term tenant watches them pass and wonders what will be left of the building they once knew. Night, today. The facade is lit. Cars glide by. The city hums. Most pedestrians never stop. They see a pretty old building. They do not see the layers. But the building remembers. And now we can finally answer the question we began with. If a building tries to become a world, what does it end up collecting? If you want to understand why the Ansonia keeps producing stories, spend one imagined evening in its lobby. The street outside is chaotic. Broadway traffic, voices, a constant scrape of the city's energy. Inside, the lobby changes the temperature of attention. People slow down, not because they are calm, but because they are being watched. In a grand building, the lobby is a small stage. You do not enter it without performing something, even if your performance is simply pretending you do not care. A well-dressed resident crosses the floor with practiced ease. A guest pauses near the desk, trying to look like they belong. A doorman reads the room and decides which face needs warmth and which face needs distance. The lobby is where privacy begins. It is the threshold between public city and private world, and thresholds are where power concentrates. This is why the Ansonia could be a home for artists and a tool for schemers. The lobby could welcome everyone who looked right, and the rest of the building could swallow them. A musician can pass through with sheet music and be left alone. A businessman can pass through with a suitcase and not be questioned. A couple can pass through without explaining their relationship. A gambler can pass through without explaining his money. The building does not ask. It filters. Once you understand the lobby as a stage, the rest of the Ansonia makes emotional sense. The suites are backstage. The corridors are wings. The elevators are quick scene changes. That is why this address keeps appearing in so many different chapters of New York life. It is a machine for turning ordinary movement into story. And now we step into the last stretch of our narrative. We have seen the Ansonia as fantasy, as scandal, as cultural engine, and as survival project. What remains is the meaning. The Ansonia is often described through extremes: magnificent, absurd, decadent, dangerous, historic, wounded, saved. It can be all of those, depending on the decade. But underneath the extremes are three simple truths. First, New York sells privacy as luxury. The Ansonia proved it early. Thick walls and hotel service insulated residents from the street. That insulation nurtured art. It also nurtured secrecy. Second, New York turns contradiction into energy. The Ansonia could be a home for musicians and a meeting place for gamblers. A palace upstairs and an underground stage downstairs. The city does not choose one identity. It stacks them. Third, New York survives by repurposing memory. A farm owner roof becomes a legend. A basement pool becomes a cultural venue. A threatened palace becomes a landmark. A landmark becomes condominiums. The story does not end. It changes form. So when people fixate on the weirdest detail, seals or livestock, do not treat it as trivia. Treat it as a clue to the psychology of the place. A building that wants to be a city must offer more than comfort. It must offer possibility. Possibility for greatness. Possibility for reinvention. Possibility for secrecy. Possibility for betrayal. Possibility for survival. The Ansonia offered all of that, and it paid the price in decades of conflict. Final image. Walk past 73rd and Broadway at night. Look at the windows that glow. Behind one, someone cooks dinner. Behind another, someone practices quietly. Behind another, someone remembers an era that is gone. And behind the stone itself, the building holds the echoes of everything it has contained. Opera scales, whispered deals, legal battles, basement applause. A palace that tried to become a world that moved in and made it complicated. And one last question, the kind no building answers out loud. When a place becomes expert at holding secrets, does it ever learn how to forget?